Good afternoon, guys. Welcome back. This is the 10th class and the last class of the backend part. We'll finish here the backend, but don't worry because we'll continue with the front end. I hope you enjoy the class and you have a lot to learn here and you get out of the course as much as you can. So first of all, let's take a look at how or where we have finished this last time. And I remember we have created a controller, which was a hello controller. In the meantime, I gave it another name. So please replace the hello to all users because it's a much more professional endpoint than the hello. Right? That's the first amendment you have to make. And I realized when I got ready for this class that there was something else in the database we have to change. And when you go to your PG admin and you check out your database table here, then actually you can see how many records you have if you right click and you say view and all rows, right? It will list the database records you have in the database. Look at this. I have at the moment 4 different records in the database and the IDs are different. So last time this ID was number 1, but in the meantime, I have deleted that record twice and I put the record again. So it picked up the new ID, which is number 3. And you still see the 6, the 9, and the 7 as IDs, but you don't see the 4 and the 5. It is because I deleted those records and you can see only these ones. So what is the amendment you have to make here? Actually, when we created the ID field, it's a primary key. We stated this, but we forgot to state that this field should be auto-incremented. And this is kind of hard here in the PostgreSQL database. It's not like in MySQL. In MySQL, there is a small box we have to tick. And if we tick that box, actually, it will be auto-incremented. I'm in this column. But here we don't have this option in PostgreSQL. So what you need to do is, so that to make this auto-incremented column, you have to right click here on the table name and click on Query Tool. So you get a nice query tool which is empty, and you have to put in your query you want to run here, so that to make that column auto-incremented. So I have already put the script you would need. Actually, this is the script you would need right here. And just give me a second. It is this one, right? So when you run this script, yeah, make sure actually that you just adjust these type of things to your own database. Because what is this website schema? The website schema is the name of your schema. The website is actually your table name. And this is just the ID sequence you just add to the end of this sentence. And the next one is owned by the ID column. It's very important. So you refer to the schema and the table and the column name. So this column will actually possess this sequence you will create. The sequence is needed because in this PostgreSQL database, you will achieve the incrementation with this actually. So it's gonna increment your column always by 1 if a new record will be input. So, and here you have to make sure that the alter table is here and the alter column ID set default and this expression. So if it's here, then you have to commit it into the database once you run it. How can you run it? Here is this small icon. It's like a lightning icon. It says execute. So once you click on the icon, basically it's gonna run, and then this statement will be performed here in the database, and you will make the ID column as an auto-incremented column. So these are the amendments right here you have to do. Don't forget that, and then we can go on with the code. So let's get back to the code to Eclipse, and let's see what else we need. So if we get back to a repository, we had this find all function, but I added one more line here, which is optional. Actually, this is a find by ID. So it's another function, and it says if we pass in the ID here and we call this function, we will find the record by the ID. So that means if we come back here and we list the data, let's click on all rows. And that means when we give in these IDs here as parameters, it will find the whole record in the database. So that's the meaning of that line here in the repository. Okay, so it is not really much. I mean, you just have to add this one line and we are done with that. With the repository is already done, right? What's the next step? So the next step is we come to the service file, to the service.java file. And basically we have to extend it with some lines because we only had last time this user service, user repo, user repository, and that's what we had. And this find all, yes, we also input this one. So that's what we had last time. But what's the next? So we want to create a function with which we are choosing only one record from the database, not all like here. So therefore, you need to add this function to the service.java file so that with the find by ID function, you can find one record from the database. Of course, you must use the user repository find by ID function. And this part here at the end, it makes us possible just to throw an error if something happens with the database. Let's say the database is not accessible or there is something else, another problem, and the function cannot return a record because the database is not accessible. In that case, this function will return an error message. That's why we add this or else throw option. And the next one is we add another function with which actually we add the new data to the repository. So when we call this function, this is the function name, it returns nothing actually because all it does is that it will input this user will pass in later, and once we pass this in and we call the function, we are calling the user repository dot save function, which we save the new user into the repository and through the repository into the database. All right, so that's for the new user. And here, this one is actually when we want to remove a user from the database. That means I don't need a record anymore. And I will call this function the remove user function. And it will call the user repository dot delete by ID. And basically here is a mistake because it should be only one sign like this. So when we call this, it will remove the record from the database. That's important. Okay, what is the last one we need? We need an update user function. The update user function is basically important when we want to update the record. So it means we are here and we want to change the address in this record or the email address or the name, then in this case, we have to call this update user method. So these are the new stuffs you have to put in. And once you put these in, actually we are done. Okay, these are very small functions, so these are not long at all. So you can input them very easily. And the last one is when we come to the controller. In the controller, we have to create the new endpoints. We already have the all users endpoint, right? So if we have that, we still need another one, when we return only one user for the front end. And that's also get mapping because we are getting data from the database. We are not bringing data into the database, we are getting. So that's why it's a get mapping. The value, the endpoint name is user slash ID. As you see, I use the curly brackets here. When I use the curly brackets, it means it's just a parameter. So when you call this, actually you don't have to use the curly brackets. You have to change the value to the real value you want to pass in. But you will see, when we practice how to test the endpoint. Okay, so it's almost the same, this one like this one. The only difference is that we use a parameter here. That's a new parameter. Here we don't use any parameter. We just return all users from the database. And here we return a response entity, which is user type, with the get user function. That's the name of the function. And the function parameter is referring to this ID. So when we are calling the path variable here and we pass in the value ID, it means the user ID. Actually, this is the real parameter this function is using. The user ID will be the ID from here, which we pass in. Okay, and then we create an object, which is a user object. So that's the type of the object. This is the name of the object, and we state this that's final. It cannot be changed after this in the code. And here's a try-catch block. If you look at the Java try-catch block in Google, you will understand when the try branch is performing and when the catch branch is performing. Actually, when everything is all right and there is no error, no exception, then the try is running. So what's happening, the user value will be the user service dot find by ID. So we are calling this function and we pass in the user ID as a parameter. And this variable will pick up this value, which is returned here. And then after that, this user will be passed in here, right here. And we are also giving back a HTTP status OK for the front end. That means the front end will get the user and we only want one user, and we'll get another message that the operation was correct, was okay. So and you also get back an okay message from the backend. So that's all. It's not that complicated, this one. So this one actually returns a new user from the database. So if I scroll down, you see the next one. That's a post mapping, so it's not a get mapping. Post mapping means we are writing something into the database. So if we call this endpoint, that's the name of the endpoint, and here, the return value will be a HTTP status. That's the name of the function, the register user, and we are using the request body annotation. So we can get the user from the front end. So the front end sends a request to the backend. And when the backend gets this request, there is a body. You'll see when we practice this later. So there is a body, and this body will be gotten. Basically, that's gonna be used here. That's gonna be the parameter of this function. The try block is running, so it means we are adding this user with the user service add user function. We are calling this. And once we've done that, actually it's returning an OK value for the front end that everything went all right. If something happens and the operation is unsuccessful, in that case we have to return an exception and a HTTP status forbidden message to the front end. So actually this function here is responsible for writing the new user into the database. So the next one is the delete mapping function, which means this is responsible for deleting one user from the database. It means um, the response entity is actually the return value, and this is the delete user function, and it's also using the path variable, so that we get this ID from here, from the endpoint. And once this ID is clear, that it will be passed to the user ID. So the user ID is actually the ID we are referring to here. And then we are calling the user service remove user with the parameter, and then it's going to be removed from the database, and we are returning the OK value. But if something went wrong and this doesn't happen, actually this catch block will be running, and then we are returning a message to the front end. And the last one is the put mapping. So the put mapping is basically when we want to update a record in the database, we have to change something in one existing record. So we are calling only this endpoint, that's the name of the endpoint, and this is the name of the function, and we are using the request body because we'll get this from the front end, and we are checking, the request body, and we are returning a HTTP status. And once everything is okay, we are calling the user service update user method, and then update the user in the database and return an OK status to the front end. But if something goes wrong and this is not successful, in that case, we have to call the catch block and then return a value, a HTTP status value, which is forbidden. And this is what the front end will get. So actually, that's all. I mean, if you have all these, the backend is finished, and now we have to check if this backend is going all right or not. Before we do that, you have to click on File and Save All. And once you save all, it's good. It's recommended that you create a Maven build so that the whole thing is built. So how you do that? Use the Maven command like Maven clean install, and you run the build, and basically if it's successful, then everything is okay, and you create the bytecode file, and then you can deploy it onto the server, right? So the build is successful. If you switch to the target folder, so I will write cd target. We are here in the target folder, and if I make a dir, and I see here is the file, this is the demo001 snapshot.jar. This includes the whole application we have created here, right? And this is what we have to deploy onto the server. Or if we are running here, we just have to start this file. It's a runnable jar. But let me talk about a bit, if you don't employ this here, if you don't deploy this here locally, but you want to deploy this onto a real server so that everybody can see that on the internet. The only thing you need to do is basically, because usually we don't deploy a jar file on the server, only here on our local machine. But when you deploy this on a server, you should create a war file. Earlier, I already said a few stuffs about the war file, but what's the difference, the jar file and the war file? Actually, a war file is maybe I would call it a larger unit, including more jar files, and that's the usual way to deploy a Java application on a server. So to get a war file instead of a jar file, all you need to do is that here's this POM file, and in the POM file, you have to add another tag, like the properties tag, but it's a brand new tag. It's called packaging. And you add this packaging, and you write here var, W-A-R. And then you have to check anyway on the internet how to put this tag here in the POM file so that you get a var file. And if you get a var file instead of a jar file, then you can put it on your server and start the application there, right? So if you start the application there, then basically you can try it, and you can see how it's running on the server. But we are going to try it here in our local machine, and you will see how it's running. Okay, so let's try it and let's see that.